Hi everyone and welcome to another Korean lesson from Korean Studio. My name is Kim Gi-hwan. Now, following on from our previous video on learning the Korean number systems, today we're going to learn various ways in which these number systems are used in Korean. And first up is counting in Korean. Now, when you count things in English, you can say 1 book, 2 books, 3 books, and so on. So you say a number word and either a singular noun or a plural noun. However, the way we count things in Korean is a little different. To say 1 book, we say 책 한 권, 책 한 권. To say 2 books, we say 책 두 권, 책 두 권. And to say 3 books, we say 책 세 권, 책 세 권. So you can clearly see a pattern here, and that pattern is, first we say the noun we're counting, and it's not important to say singular or plural form. So we just say the noun as it is. Then we use the native Korean number, and then we use a counter word. Now, there are a couple of things to point out. First, native Korean numbers 1 to 4 and 20 are shortened when we count things. So 하나 becomes 한, 둘 becomes 두, 셋 becomes 세, 넷 becomes 네, and lastly, 스물 becomes 스무. Second, in Korean, we have a lot of different counter words, and we use a specific counter word to count certain things. 권 is a counter word we use to count books. Here are a few more examples of counter words. 사람 한 명, one person. 사람 한 명. 개 두 마리, two dogs. 개 두 마리. 맥주 세 병, 3 bottles of beer. 맥주 세 병. 종이 4장, 4 sheets of paper. 종이 4장. 펜 5개, 5 pens. 펜 5개. Okay, so first we have the counter word 명, and we use 명 to count people. 명 is the standard counter word to count people, but if we're counting people we need to be respectful towards, we use the counter word 분. 마리 is a counter word we use to count animals, different kinds of sea creatures such as fish and lobsters, and also insects. So as well as dogs, we can say 오징어 두 마리, 2 squids, and this word 오징어 has become quite popular these days. And also we can say 벌 세 마리, 3 bees. Next, we have the counter word for bottles, 병, which we can use to count any kind of bottles. Then we have 장, which we use to count paper. Lastly, we use 개, which is a general counter word we use to count all kinds of inanimate objects. However, one thing to note is that if based on the context, the meaning of the noun is obvious, we can just say the number word and the counter word. So if it's obvious that I'm counting dogs, I don't have to use the noun 개. I can just say 한 마리, 한 마리. Now, there are many other counter words in Korean, and these are some of the more common counter words used in Korean. However, one piece of advice I would give is that if you are counting objects, but you're not sure which counter word to use, then just go with 개, as 개 is the most common counter word we use with general objects. Now, the main use of native Korean numbers is to count things in Korean. And since counting is a very common way of using numbers in any language, the use of native Korean numbers is very common in everyday speech. Let's now move on and take a look at how we use Sino-Korean numbers. Now, if you watched our previous video on learning the Korean number systems, we already went over the most important use of Sino-Korean numbers, which is to talk about money. So let's take a look at some other ways that we use Sino-Korean numbers. Another common use of Sino-Korean numbers is to talk about the date. So to say January 1st, we say 1월 1일, 1월 1일. 월 means month and 일 means day. So to say the date, we use number words that refer to the month and date in front of 월 and 일. So to say November 4th, we say 11월 4일, 11월 4일. Another use of Sino-Korean numbers is when we talk about numbers in math. So to say 10 plus 5 in Korean, we would say 10 더하기 5. 10 더하기 5. And 더하기 means addition plus. We also use Sino-Korean numbers to talk about phone numbers. So if my phone number was 1234567, we would say each digit individually and say 1234567. 1234567. Now at this point, let's talk about the number 0 in Korean. In Korean, we have two words for 0, 영 and 공. Both are Sino-Korean numbers and each has its own specific uses. We use 영 to talk about temperature. So if it's 0 degrees, we would say 영도, 영도. And as you can probably tell, 도 means degree in temperature. We also use 영 to refer to 0 in math. So to say 0.5, we say 0.5, 0.5. And 점 means point. Lastly, we use 영 to talk about scores in games. So if the score of a game was 3-0, in Korean, this would be 3대 0, 3대 0. 공 also means 0, but its sole use is to talk about 0 in phone numbers. So if someone's phone number was 301, we would say 301, 301. And we would never say 301. And interestingly, to say 007 in Korean, we say 007, 007. So that's another use of 0, 공. So as well as talking about money, we use Sino-Korean numbers to talk about date, to talk about numbers in math, and to talk about phone numbers. And there are two zeros in Sino-Korean numbers, 영 and 공, and each one has its own specific uses. Let's now take a look at some other ways that we use Sino-Korean numbers and also native Korean numbers. Okay, so let's talk about time. When we say the time, we use syllables that mean hour and minute, and these are 시 and 분. And in front of these words, we use a number word to indicate what time it is. However, when we talk about the time, we use both number systems. So to say 1:15, we say 1시 15분, 1시 15분. So as you can see, we use native Korean numbers to say the hour and Sino-Korean numbers to say the minute. And to give you another example, to say 8:40, we would say 8시 40분, 8시 40분. So again, we use native Korean number to say the hour and Sino-Korean number to say the minute. And similarly, when we count hours, minutes, and seconds, we use both native Korean numbers and Sino-Korean numbers. So 3 hours in Korean is 3시간, 3시간. 30 minutes is 30분, 30분. And 10 seconds is 10초, 10초. So we use different number words to count different time measurements. Now, as we have seen with time, not everything in Korean is counted with native Korean numbers. Similarly, when we count year, months, and days, we can use Sino-Korean numbers. So 1 year is 1년, 1년. 2 months is 2개월, 2개월. And 3 days is 3일, 3일. So we use the counter words 년, 개월, and 일 with Sino-Korean numbers to count years, months, and days. However, this is where it gets kind of interesting. In Korean, some things can be counted in more than one way. For example, to count months, we can also use the counter word 달. And with 달, we use native Korean numbers. So to say 2 months using 달, we can say 두 달, 두 달. Now the main reason for this is because 개월 is rooted in Chinese language, while 달 is rooted in Korean language. So generally, we use Sino-Korean numbers with counter words rooted in Chinese, while native Korean numbers are used with counter words rooted in Korean. Another example is the counter word for age, 살. 살 is rooted in Korean language. So to say 30 years old using 살, we can say 30살, 30살. So 살 is used with a native Korean number. However, we also have another counter word for age, and that's 세. And 세 is used with Sino-Korean numbers as it's rooted in Chinese language. So to say 30 years old using 세, we would say 30세, 30세. However, do note that this rule of using Sino-Korean numbers with counter words rooted in Chinese and native Korean numbers with counter words rooted in Korean is not an absolute rule, as there are many exceptions. For example, the counter word for hour, 시간, is rooted in Chinese language, but it's used with a native Korean number. And another example is the counter word for people, 명. And 명 is also rooted in Chinese language, but we use native Korean numbers with 명. So there are many exceptions to this rule of using number words with counter words rooted in certain language. Okay, so today we went over how we use native Korean numbers to count things. We went over how we use Sino-Korean numbers to talk about money, date, numbers in math, and also phone numbers. We also learned how we use the 2 zeros in Korean, and we learned various ways of talking about time and date, as well as how we can use both Sino-Korean numbers and native Korean numbers to count things. Okay, so I hope this lesson has helped you to better understand how Korean numbers are used. That's it for today, and I hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.